Hey internets, this video is going to be the most concise but still relatively complete refutation possible of the claim that racism equals prejudice plus power, and that therefore minorities can't be racist. I have to some degree already refuted this in my series on woke ideology, but I realized it would be helpful to people if I made a dedicated video that brought together kind of all the pieces of the puzzle behind why claiming that racism equals prejudice plus power is such an absurd thing to say. But to also show that I'm not strawmanning the point people are making when they say this, I'm going to explain it while responding to a short lecture from Tim Wise, a relatively well-known and respected figure within the anti-racist movement, where he gives the prejudice plus power argument and the justifications behind it. So let's get started.
Racism, by definition, to me, and this is not just to me, it's a grammatical thing, right? If you have a word that ends with ism and ism, it is almost by definition two things: an ideology and a system. So you think of other examples: communism, socialism, capitalism, fascism. These are ideologies. They're ways of viewing the world, seeing the world. They're also ways of organizing it, right, as a system. So at a systemic level, people of color can't really effectively exercise racism.
So right away, the first problem we see with prejudice plus power is, at its core, the argument really is just pedantry over a semantical disagreement over the root meaning of words, and it's a disagreement that is neither necessary nor correct. Because the etymology of the suffix ism has its roots in Greek and comes from ismos, and looking into the specific suffix, the way it has been classically used has been more of a broad usage where many things can be considered an ism so long as they meet some of the criteria, rather than an exclusionary usage that requires a word to meet all of the possible criteria to be considered a quote-unquote ism. So rather than it needing to be a system and a doctrine and an ideology, it can be used for either a system or a doctrine. And its actual usage is even broader than that. It can also be used for just a simple school of thought. It can be used to describe different epistemologies. And more colloquially, such as looking at just Webster, it's also often used as theories or religions, etc., etc. Like Buddhism here, for example. Have you ever heard anybody try to argue that Buddhism shouldn't be an ism in the West because it doesn't have enough systemic power in the West as a result of being a minority religion? No, of course not. Nobody would ever make that argument. And so right away, this argument of racism equals prejudice plus power, well, in a grammatical way, to use Tim Wise's own words here, it's not really an argument that can be said from any consistent use of ism as a suffix. I'm pretty sure if you were to ask any leftist academic who pushes prejudice plus power if Buddhism should lose the ism suffix at the end of its word, they'd probably just look at you funny. In fact, interestingly enough, they'd probably accuse you of being a bigot against Buddhism for even asking the question. They'd probably say, oh, of course it should be considered an ism. What are you talking about? And so that's the first reason why you really shouldn't take prejudice plus power seriously, because the people pushing it themselves don't really take it seriously. But for the sake of argument, let's just pretend that it makes sense, because there's actually far more interesting reasons for why prejudice plus power is such a bad argument. So let's continue with the next clip.
Racism. Now, at the ideological level, I will be more than happy, for the sake of argument, to say that at the ideological level, anybody can be racist. Anybody can have a racist belief. But it's like, I can be a capitalist up here in North Korea, but I ain't getting very far with that, right? I can't actually effectuate my capitalist thinking into capitalism in practice. I could be a communist in a capitalist economy, but I'm not getting very far with that.
Okay, so this is the one point that the prejudice plus power crowd have that is kind of valid. Yes, it is true that for an ideology to actually exist beyond the mind and be put into practice, it does need some kind of real-world power for it to get going. However, the problem with that is that he has shifted the goalpost. That one point having validity to it doesn't meaningfully demonstrate why the word itself needs to be completely redefined. That is shifting us to an entirely different discussion. Why not just say minorities can be racist, but it's harder for them to find representation due to being minorities? And I'll have more on why I suspect they do this later. The main takeaway here is that just because it's harder to get power, well, on an individual level, that doesn't mean that an individual can't contextually have power in their specific circumstances. Just listen to what he says next.
It's sort of like, I guess the analogy I would use, if you have a stationary combustion engine and there's no fuel that's going to that engine to make it operate, it's still an engine, but it's not going to get you from point A to point B. Once you add the fuel to it is when it's operational. And so the fuel is equivalent to power, right? So I can say, yeah, okay, there might be such a thing as black racism as a stationary combustion engine that just sits there and sort of hurts your feelings. right? But it's not going to do very much to you because it doesn't have the power to do so. And that makes it qualitatively different and quantitatively different.
And there it is. There's the reification fallacy. This right here is the biggest problem with racism equals prejudice plus power. Reification as a reasoning error occurs when someone mistakenly treats a concept as a concretely real thing, which leads them to make faulty comparisons that have no grounds in reality. I explained how this works at length in my video on the flaws of collectivist brain rot, but the TLDR of it is that Tim Wise is using an analogy of fuel powering an engine here. Those are two things that are concretely real, and yet he is comparing it to a concept of collective power extrapolated from group averages, which is not concretely real. That's the big logical screw up here. It's also a very sneaky reification fallacy being committed because it's nested in an analogy which is then used to create a false comparison. Collective power is a concept that describes how much power a person who belongs to a particular group might have based on, again, the averages. And that's a problem because it doesn't tell you how much power a person actually has in reality. It does not actually prove anything about the amount of actual concretely real power an individual may actually possess in any specific context. It is not concretely real in this ubiquitous sense and thus cannot be asserted to be real in the same sense that fuel is. At least not in an individual framework. If that sounds confusing, here's an example to make this reasoning error a bit easier to spot. Let's say you have a black adolescent, and he harbors prejudiced feelings against white people, and so he decides to put himself in a situation where he can try and get away with stabbing a white adolescent teenager. And he succeeds. But the thing is, if this collective power was a concretely real thing, then that should not be possible. For example, in the Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf scenario, then there should have been some kind of magical collective power barrier that Austin Metcalf would automatically draw from some kind of mysterious monopool of white collective power that would somehow come out and magically shield him from being stabbed. And yes, of course, that's obviously not how reality works. That sounds silly, but the thing is, that's what Tim Wise is unwittingly implying should happen. If we treat the concept of average power as a concretely real thing independent of individualized context, then this kind of magical scenario is the kind of completely insane thing that reasoning ends up implying. But of course, there is no magical white power barrier because collective power is not a thing. It's just based on the averages. But averages, of course, do not always translate to the reality that individuals actually experience, which is a problem if you're trying to argue that it should be a new definition, because the point of definitions is to be consistent for the sake of conveying meaning, which by itself is enough to show you why this argument has already failed. Once you understand that they're just reifying collective power dynamics, and then implying that that's somehow by some form of magic always relevant in all contexts, when it very obviously very much is not, then racism equals prejudice plus power just kind of immediately melts into a puddle of nonsense. And that's the big reason why I wanted to make this video. It's very important that people understand this more deeper reason why racism equals P plus B is really dumb to say. Because sure, you could argue against it from the semantical framework, because again, the etymology of the suffix ism doesn't actually require power, and so thus you could technically reject the argument on its face on that problem alone. But it is also important to understand the absolute lunacy of what they are implying, because their reasoning really does imply that if a black guy robs a white guy in an alley by pulling a gun on him or something, then well, that contextual power wouldn't matter because actually collective power is all that matters, and thus some kind of magical barrier will come manifesting from the void in order to protect the white guy from the actual real power of the gun. It sounds crazy and it sounds stupid, but that is really what they're implying. But anyway, let's see how he wraps this up.
Of them may be equally objectionable. It might be just as immoral for a person of color to believe I'm inferior as it is for me to believe they're inferior, but a person of color who believes I'm inferior is not going to be the bank officer, is not going to be the employer, is not going to be the cop. I'm sure there are black cops that get tired of white spoiled college kids and high school students in privileged areas around the country, but they're not profiling them, and they're not pulling them over out of the car and beating them with clubs, and they're not shooting them by and large. So in that regard, even if you have bigotry, prejudice, or what we could call racism, if you're a person of color, you are very limited in what you're able to get away with that attitude, whereas white folks can take a pen and zone you out of existence. Right, and bring in a bulldozer to knock down your house. You know, black folks in Baltimore can get mad at white cops and throw some Molotov cocktails through the CVS, and white Baltimore can come in and knock down entire black neighborhoods to make way for the interstate. Now, you tell me which one is more effective. It's pretty obvious, right? It's pretty obvious.
So yeah, if you couldn't tell, the way he's wrapping this up is effectively just the equity fallacy. He's taking things that are more likely, arguably, to happen to you if you are black, or situations that you might more likely find yourself in depending on your ethnicity, and asserting that those statistical averages imply some kind of intentional discrimination. I've already debunked this at length. It's one of my earliest videos. It's not a sustainable argument, especially here in the year 2026, where some of these averages aren't even true anymore. For example, one of the studies I mentioned in my previous video, which was actually gonna be a full game rant with this video, I just decided it'd be better to have them as two separate videos. The data I cited about how in the UK, you're actually more likely to be on the receiving end of ethnic bias as a white person than a minority these days. Okay, so where are the leftists saying that white people can't be racist in the UK? Nowhere. Of course, they know none of them make that argument, which then brings me to the final problem with racism equals P plus P, is that these people are completely inconsistent with it. Because the thing is, I honestly suspect that most of them don't even actually believe it. And you can tell this at the end of Tim Wise's lecture. You may have noticed that he kind of walked the argument back a bit. He Mott and Bailey'd a bit. He even admitted, okay, well actually as an ideology, these things may be, again, equally objectionable, admitting that the prejudice is just as bad either way. Okay, then why try and force it as a new definition in the first place if you know that it's still bad? And the answer, of course, ultimately, is because anti-racist ideology is a collectivist ideology, and they really don't want to admit that collective guilt for thee but not for we is a very obviously unprincipled and self-contradictory stance to take, because that would force them to conclude that you can't fix collective guilt with more collective guilt. And so they engage in this kind of attempt to redefine racism at its root as a form of mental gymnastic to avoid admitting that their ideology doesn't actually make any sense. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, being a member of the channel, or by buying some merch, of which I still have the Taxation is Theft hat on sale. But yeah, thanks again. That is all. Till next time.